It's 3 p.m. and you're searching for sugar. You're in the pantry looking for those sweets, the chocolate, the lollies, the sweet cookies, biscuits. You told yourself that you were going to eat healthier today. You were going to break this cycle. Yet here you are, yet again, reaching for that sugar. The sugar, these cravings that you're having, they have a spell on you. Does this sound familiar? If it does, you are definitely not alone. Sugar cravings are one of the most common things that the mums I work with express to me as something they want to get on top of, something that's bothering them. And today we are going to unpack the 5 reasons that this might be happening and what you can do to overcome them. So, hello and welcome to this channel or this podcast. If you are new here, welcome back. If you are coming back for another video or episode, my name is Georgie. I'm a naturopath for mums, especially tired mums. I help them to overcome exhaustion and rediscover themselves in motherhood so that they can go on to enjoy the wild ride of motherhood ahead. Before we jump in, if you are in fact a tired mum and you found your way here to this video or to this podcast, then you might benefit from my free guide for tired mums. It's a really simple, straightforward, easy to implement 7-step guide for ways to boost your energy today. The link to download that will be just below either this video or on the blog page if you're listening to the audio. So grab your copy at the end of the episode. Today, as I said, we're going to be covering why we get cravings, and I'm going to go through the top 5 reasons that I see, or the most common reasons. And we're going to talk about, with all of those things in mind that we're going to cover, how to overcome these cravings, how to reduce them, and how to feel like you have a bit more of a sense of control when it comes to sugar and sweets and carbohydrate-rich foods. So let's jump in with reason number 1. This is the very first and the most common one, and it has to do with our blood sugar balance. Sugar cravings, anytime I hear mums describe this intense sugar cravings, the flag goes off in my mind immediately around blood sugar regulation. I've spoken about this before in previous videos and blog posts. I will link them for you somewhere up here on the screen. So I won't take a super deep dive on it today, but if sugar cravings are something that are bothering you, you must think about your blood sugar balance. In a very overview nutshell, blood sugar balance, what we're looking at here with the sugar cravings is typically the cravings come on when our blood sugar is actually dropping lower than where our body would like it to be. So our body really wants to keep our blood sugar levels, our blood glucose levels in this very tightly regulated kind of Goldilocks zone. Not too high, not too low, just right. And when it goes too high or too low, the body will work very quickly. It senses this as a bit of a physiological emergency. It'll work very quickly to bring those levels back into the Goldilocks zone. And what happens around the cravings is that usually your blood sugar has spiked. So you can think of it a bit like the roller coaster. I've referred to this sort of metaphor before. We're going on the up. Blood sugar is spiking on the up route of that roller coaster, on the up rail, whatever you call it. And what goes up must come down. The body is going to try to rein that in, pull that in and get it down. And so then we go on this sort of steep decline on the other side where our blood sugar is rapidly dropping. And it's usually at the bottom of that big roller coaster drop or blood sugar drop where we'll get the sugar cravings. And the reason this happens is because now our blood sugar levels are actually getting too low. This is what's known as reactive hypoglycemia. Hypo being low, glycemia being blood sugar levels. this is now a different kind of emergency. And so those cravings are the body's way of trying to get us to eat something that will very quickly help to get those blood sugar levels up. That's why we crave sweets or sugary food or simple carbohydrate rich foods too. When I talk about sugar cravings, more generally, most people are thinking about, that sweet tooth. I just want something sweet and chocolate and lollies and cookies and cakes, those kind of things. But if we're reaching for those carbohydrate foods as well, the simple carbs, breads, crackers, chips, pasta, if you're sensing that craving those kind of foods too, it's usually the same kind of mechanisms, especially when we're talking about blood sugar regulation. So we're on that downhill spiral. The body wants quick energy. It's going to try to get you to reach for sugary foods. And what goes hand in hand with this, almost always what I see is mothers are under eating protein. And this is usually one of the biggest reasons that our blood sugar balance is off, and we end up on the roller coaster where we're spiking and crashing and getting those sugar cravings on the way down. So number 1, blood sugar balance. Let's move on to number 2. This is kind of obvious and maybe not a lot we can do about it, but the number 2 reason is being sleep deprived or exhausted. So when we are, or the influence of a broken sleep on our sugar cravings is kind of threefold. Some interesting things happen on a biochemical level when we do face that ongoing broken sleep. And look, if you are a mum of a wakeful baby or you're just in a really rough patch with sleep, it can sometimes be hard to hear these things because while I don't have that much control over the sleep and learning this just makes me feel bad and what's the point? But I believe it's important to understand what the impacts of the sleep, the broken sleep, the sleep deprivation are so that you are empowered to take actions, take steps in your food, in your meals, in your days to try and counterbalance what's going on there if you're not going to change things with the sleep piece. So it's threefold. Let me explain. The first interesting thing that happens is that we see an increase in cannabinoid activity in the central nervous system. So cannabinoid refers to a little compound that's made naturally in the body, and it has various different functions. But one of the impacts that it has in the context of sugar cravings is that it increases our desire for tasty foods, for palatable foods, and it also decreases our inhibition around food. So that's sort of part of our brain that might say, oh, okay, I'm the chocolate, the lollies, but I won't. That's the brakes that go on before we make those choices, take those actions. You may, that word may sound familiar, cannabinoid, and that's because, or you might be familiar with it from cannabis, the plant, and many of the compounds that have been identified in cannabis are called cannabinoids, and they have bioactive roles if they ever get ingested in whatever form. And we also make our own endogenous, we make them ourselves, cannabinoids. And so this is something that's been observed in research on sleep. Quite interesting. So that's one thing driving the cravings. The second thing is our blood sugar regulation, our blood sugar balance, which we just discussed previous to this, is impacted by broken sleep. So we become what's known as more insulin resistant, which means that it's more difficult for the glucose in our blood to get into the cells. And so the levels in the blood can rise and we get that kind of roller coaster effect that I described just a moment ago happening, in a heightened way when we are facing that chronic ongoing broken sleep. So that's the second part of the sleep piece. And the third part is the fatigue, the exhaustion that comes with chronic broken sleep. Naturally, when we are more exhausted, our body is going to want to reach for easily digested foods that give us a quick hit of energy, because it's a way of getting that little energy boost when we don't necessarily have the opportunity to sleep or to do something else that will boost us up. The impact of broken sleep, or the relationship rather, to the sugar cravings are via the cannabinoid activity, so that little compound in the central nervous system, the blood sugar piece that we also talked about, and then just being exhausted and fatigued naturally plays into that too. Which brings us to our third most common reason, and it's simply just eating the wrong foods. Now, this is kind of a big topic. It's not just as simple as that. Really, what I'm referring to here is eating too much hyperpalatable foods. You might have heard that term before, hyperpalatable. What we're really talking about here are foods that are unnaturally delicious, is probably the most simple way to put that. And they are typically, or almost always, processed foods. So they are like a man-made concoction of some sort. We don't see hyperpalatable foods naturally occurring in nature. And what the combination of ingredients that typically makes foods, what we're calling hyperpalatable, is this combination of sugar, fat, and salt. And that combination, look, that might not mean much to you, and that's okay, but let me explain it a little bit more just to put it into context. That combination is not found in any foods in nature. So these man-made versions of food, these ultra-processed foods that we're getting from the supermarket and on the shelves, packaged foods, convenience foods, they are predominantly some sort of combination of sugar, salt, and fat. And again, when I say sugar, generally we're thinking of like sweet sugar, honey, maple, those kind of sweeteners. But in a food science sense, sugar is really referring to the compounds. So yes, it will include the sugars, but it's also going to include things like starches as well that break down into those simple sugars. So that includes a lot of those foods that you would find on the shelf in the supermarket, including a lot of the time some of the savory options that we aren't intuitively classifying as a sugary sweet food, but on a biochemical level, it functions or it influences our body in a very similar way. What happens with this combination, why it's relating to our cravings and why I want to talk about it today, is that it overrides our natural appetite regulation mechanisms. So we have these intricate, very fascinating appetite regulation mechanisms influenced by hormones and our nervous system, our digestive system, lots of players in these systems. And they've evolved with us over all this time that humans have been here on the planet, interacting with the environment, eating food from nature. And so we've developed mechanisms to regulate appetite based on the types of food that we typically find and typically eat or have done in our history. But in recent times, with the explosion of processed foods and this very unnatural combination of sugars and salt and fat all together in perfect amounts that work for our palate and that just make us drool, make us unable to resist the foods, our body doesn't have very good mechanisms to regulate against or in context of eating these kinds of foods. And so we are so much more likely to overconsume these kind of foods and crave them and want more of them, because in an evolutionary sense, it would be beneficial to eat these foods because they provide valuable or highly prized nutrients. If we're talking in a kind of nature sense, like the sugars and the fat and the salt would have been parts of food that we historically really tried to access and wanted to get because they're hard to come by in nature. And now, because of this morphing of the food supply and the food environment. They are freely available completely, and we have to use our own willpower to regulate it, but the body doesn't necessarily have that switch. That reason, eating the wrong foods, eating these hyperpalatable foods, it's about a hijacking of our physiology, a hijacking of our biochemistry, and we just don't really have that off switch. We don't have the regulation, and it ends up in these kind of cravings for these foods because they're just so goddamn delicious that we can't really help ourselves. Okay, reason number 4 is you want to feel good. And I'll explain more because it's deeper than that. What I mean by that is that food, I'm often talking about food in the context of nutrition, yes, but it's so much more than that, isn't it? It's not just the sum of its nutritional parts. It's also about culture and enjoyment and entertainment and connection and relation with others, family, all those things. And within that, for a lot of us, food is about pleasure. So this is what I mean. You want to feel good. You're looking for that little kind of pleasure kick, that pleasure hit. Foods that are those hyperpalatable foods. So this sort of connects back to the reason that we just talked about with the hyperpalatable foods. These foods give us a dopamine hit, a dopamine release from our brain. It's that they send signals to the brain to release dopamine, which is basically the reward hormone or neurotransmitter, the pleasure neurotransmitter. It's what helps us to form habits. And so part of this is actually about habit, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. But when we eat these hyperpalatable foods, we essentially, if you really break it down in the biochemistry, we are getting a pleasure hit, a reward hit via the dopamine pathway. If you have that sense, if you're someone who feels out of control around sugar, or the cravings are so intense, more intense than previous phases of life, or compared to other people that you live with, your sugar cravings are just really intense and you just find it really difficult to resist the foods, then the dopamine pathway might be involved for you. It might be largely driven by habit and your need or want, whether conscious or subconscious. This is happening at the biochemical cellular level. So a lot of the time we're not super conscious of it, but it's happening anyway. You want to feel good. You want that pleasure, reward, release. So dopamine, some of you might be familiar, is the neurotransmitter involved in addiction pathways with anything that you can become addicted to. And sugar addiction is very real. There is a little bit of debate out there in the nutrition space as to whether it is real or not, but I tend to lean on the side that it is real from the various sources that I've researched and looked at, plus my clinical experience working with people. And it's mediated by this kind of pathway. And as I said, habits. A lot of it comes down to habit, and a lot of addiction is about habit too. It's about putting down those pathways, and we could get into a discussion about habits and how they're formed and what's involved. But basically it's a cue, a signal, and then you perform some sort of behavior or routine or ritual, and then you get the dopamine reward. That's what happens in terms of habits in the brain, in the body. And it so rings true for sugar. Maybe we've gotten into, I'm using quote unquote, maybe we've gotten into bad habits of just having a bit more of those sugary treat foods than we usually would. And we get into this pathway, these pathways form, these habits form in our brain. Then before we know it, we've got those cravings because the body's like, come on, I need this habit to play out because I need that dopamine kick. I need that dopamine reward at the end. So on this front, a lot of it comes down to shifting habits, making new habits and shifting old habits. And we'll get to some strategies around that in just a moment. The fifth reason is about gut health. Now, this is an often overlooked yet still absolutely crucial factor to consider. We have our microbiome, which is that ecosystem, that large community of bacteria that live in our digestive system, and they work in synergy with our body. It's really a symbiotic relationship, back and forth relationship. We want to have the healthy bacteria living in that microbiome, but for lots and lots of reasons, the balance of the bacteria living in that ecosystem can get out of balance, and we can see the overgrowth of, sometimes they're just the healthy bacteria, but they overgrow, and so it becomes out of balance. We call them opportunistic overgrowths. And sometimes it's actually an overgrowth of a not so nice bacteria that we really don't want to see in there at all, but they've been allowed to boom and flourish and overgrow. And their overgrowth of certain bacteria are associated with some food cravings, like sugar cravings. Typically what I would do when I'm working with someone, if sugar cravings and getting on top of that is a really big goal, I'd be working through some of the other things first, blood sugar balance and eating enough protein, and thinking about those habits and seeing if we can shift them, as well as making sure that we're eating like the whole foods versus those hyperpalatable foods. But if there's any really obvious signs that digestive health might be a part of the picture, and so we're thinking about obvious digestive symptoms like bloating, gas, variable bowel motions, constipation, loose stools, reflux, so many different symptoms we could look at. If that seemed like it was a part of the picture, maybe it's something that we would start working on sooner rather than later. Otherwise, it's something that we might come back around to if we've balanced blood sugar and we're eating real whole foods and all of those pieces seem to be in place, but the cravings are still there. It's likely being driven by something underlying, like these gut bacteria, the imbalance of the microbiome. A last little reason, which I suppose you could call it a bonus reason, but I'll just give it a quick honorable mention before we move on to what we can do to feel better, is around nutrient deficiencies. Because no conversation about cravings, which we're really thinking about appetite regulation and metabolism and blood sugar balance. No conversation can be had around those topics without thinking about our nutritional status, because nutrients, especially our micronutrients, excuse me, so our vitamins and our minerals, they are really the glue that keeps the ship of our body, the machine that is our body, running smoothly. They are pulling the strings, making all these little biochemical processes work. And this applies to appetite, cravings, and metabolism, as well as everything else. And in the back of my mind, I'm often also making those assessments around nutrient status for someone who's got cravings to make sure that it's not a nutrient deficiency either driving it or making it worse. And the really obvious ones we'd be thinking about would be magnesium, first and foremost. That's classic for this sugar craving picture. But we'd also want to think about chromium too. Plays a large role in blood sugar regulation, and our B vitamins and our protein status would be the major ones that I'd be thinking about. Okay, so there are our reasons, our common causes. Let's recap them briefly. 1, we had blood sugar balance and/or / protein deficiency or insufficient intake. Number 2 was being sleep deprived and exhausted. Number 3 was eating the wrong types of food. Number 4 was you want to feel good, and that kind of dopamine pathway we talked about. And number 5 was gut health, and that little bonus one on the end was nutrient status or nutrient deficiencies. Okay, let's do a power run through some of the things you can do to curb cravings. I've mentioned this a few times already in this video, but eat enough protein. And if you've listened to any amount of my videos or anything, you'll know that is my number one. Prioritize protein, and this will help to balance your blood sugar. I have a number of videos on protein, so I will link them for you here if you want to go and take a deeper dive, because I won't go deep on that here today. You can prioritize rest and protect your sleep. Now, before you switch off and stop listening, I know so much of sleep is outside of our control when it comes to our kids and motherhood and early parenting. So what I'm saying here is not about trying to control that, but it's doing what you can with what's inside your control. So it's protecting the quality of the sleep that you are getting. And I've talked about that at length over on Instagram. I've got a few posts you can go and have a look at over there, as well as prioritizing rest where you can in other parts of your life in your day, doing less, resting more, so that you're not so exhausted, not so tired. And so the impacts of sleep deprivation aren't having this really detrimental effect on your health in other ways. Next tip is don't keep your avalanche foods in the house. An avalanche food is a term that's sometimes used to describe the foods that you just cannot stop eating. This is going to be different for everyone, but it might be like that block of chocolate. If once you open it and you have a couple of squares, you just can't stop and you end up eating the whole block, that's an avalanche food. If it's the chips, once you open that chip packet, you just cannot stop. Once you pop, you can't stop, like Pringles. That's an avalanche food for you. If it's the packet of lollies that you think, I'll just have one or two, and you end up eating half the thing, avalanche food. So think that avalanche. Once it starts, it just has a mind of its own and builds momentum, and you can't stop it. And this sounds so simple. Don't keep these foods in the house, but sometimes we need that reminder. I know you want to have them, and I know you want to be able to enjoy some of those foods at some point, and you can. There's room for that. But if these foods are too triggering, too far outside of your control, they're derailing your health goals, then you need to just not have them in the house. And over time, you will recalibrate with all of these things we've talked about, all the biochemistry, all the habits, all the relationships with food that you may have. They'll recalibrate to a new set point, to a healthy place where you will be able to bring the chocolate or the lollies or the chips back into the house without avalanching. But for now, if that's happening to you, do not buy them. Do not put them on the shopping list. Do not put them in your shopping trolley. Do not get them. That brings me to another interesting thing that I think we can do, and that is about understanding whether you are what's called an abstainer or a moderator. And this might be self-explanatory, or maybe you've heard of this before, but an abstainer is somebody who really needs that black and white. I just can't have the food in the house because I know what I'm like around it. Versus a moderator is somebody who's able to be much more balanced in their approach. And in my experience, knowing this and just knowing the people in my life, but also working with clients in a clinical setting, this is definitely true. Some people definitely just have that more moderator approach and they can just have a few bites, versus the abstainers who really need to take a bit more of an extreme approach and not have it in the house, or decide, yep, I'm not eating that food for the foreseeable future until I get things back in balance. So I think it's important to know who you are and where you sit in that sense, because when it comes to sugar and cravings, you might need a full reset period. Like you might need to go low sugar, very low sugar, whereas somebody else can just use some of the more habit, blood sugar balancing approaches and still be able to eat some of those foods that are maybe a little bit problematic for them right now. So you need to identify which one you think you are. And if you want a deep dive on that, Gretchen Rubin has done some great work blogging about this. So maybe just Google Gretchen Rubin abstainers and moderators, and you can read some of her work. Next thing you can do is have a contingency plan. So when you get those cravings, because look, this can take some time to recalibrate. It depends on what's going on under the surface for you. But, if we do put the pillars in place, eating the protein, removing those hyperpalatable foods, and it can be quite quick to reduce the cravings. But we do want to have a contingency plan in place, because there will still be a period of time, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, where the cravings will still be there. They'll still be coming back. So the contingency plan is have some either like ready-made snacks at your fingertips, whether they're packaged or homemade, that neither here nor there for the purpose of this. Have a list of snacks on the fridge, like that you can quickly prepare when that sugar craving hits. And what we want to do here is aim for foods that are both nourishing and they're going to satisfy that sweet craving. Some examples might be, and it's going to be different for everyone depending on where your palate's at. If you are used to those hyperpalatable foods a lot of the time, then it's gonna be a bigger transition for you than somebody who's already mostly whole foods with a little bit of those kind of treats thrown in. It's going to be an easier transition for them in terms of their palate. Your palate needs to shift and change and get used to the taste difference between the processed, ultra processed, hyperpalatable foods and whole foods. So some examples might be yogurt with berries, and you can put a bit of maple or honey in there. I'm not against having sweets or sugar. We just want them to be balanced. Like the yogurt's going to give you lots of nice protein. You're going to get the sweetness from the berries or the fruit, whatever you put with it. A little bit of extra sweetness to find that spot where it's still enjoyable for you. That would be an example of a contingency snack. Bliss balls are a good one here too, making sure that they're just made from whole food ingredients. So like nuts, seeds, nut butters, coconut, almond flour, dried fruits, those kind of ingredients. Some are better than others in terms of like store-bought options, but this is definitely going to be a better choice than half a block of chocolate. So have some of those on hand. Or better yet, go for something savory like cheese and crackers, or a smoothie also works well here too. You can blend up a smoothie with whole food ingredients, put some yogurt, put some milk, put some collagen, as well as the fruit, so you get that sweet hit. Another good transition option is dark chocolate. So if you are a chocolate lover and that's your vice right now, see if you can slowly work your way from what you're eating, which for a lot of people is like a milk chocolate choice product of some choice. Slowly transition your way to a dark chocolate. So pick something that's a little bit darker, and then the next one you buy next week, buy it even darker again. What we want to be aiming for typically with dark chocolate is like 70% or darker. The darker the better. See if you can make a switch like that. Then when it comes to the habits piece and that dopamine pathway that we're talking about, what we need to do here basically is replace one habit with another, or replace one reward with another. So we want to get that dopamine hit, but we want to get it in a different way, not from the sugar, not from the simple carbs, not from the processed food. This will be different for everyone. Again, we're all different people, but think about something that fills up your cup, that makes you feel happy and joyful, that is not related to food. So that might be, scrolling social media is a great way to get dopamine hit. We can obviously fall too far in that direction, that become problematic, but like that is an easy, quick fix. When you get the sugar craving, can you get a dopamine hit from a few minutes on Insta or whatever your social media platform of choice is? Can you listen to your favorite song, your favorite music? That's going to give you that nice dopamine release. Get some sunlight. That does it. Cuddle with somebody you love, a baby, your child, your partner. Do something nice for someone else, which is an unusual one, but that can work. Can you move your body, even if it's just for a few minutes? Something that's like a passion or a hobby of yours. Can you read a few pages of your book, play a few minutes of a game that you like, play on an instrument, do some cooking, do some organizing? Like, it'll be specific to you, something that you derive joy from, a little hobby or a passion project of your own. And then lastly, we can consider supplements that can help us along this path. And that's really speaking back to potential deficiencies. So we're thinking our magnesiums, our chromium, our B vitamins, but there's also some interesting and useful herbs that we can call on to help us in this way. And that's something that I'm sometimes incorporating into treatment plans that I am making for the mums I work with if sugar cravings is a challenge for them. That's pretty much it for this episode. I guess just let me know if you have any questions down in the comments below. And thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.